Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Welcome back to part B of our lecture regarding the radical 60s. Now, I want to jump right back for a moment and talk about how African Americans and Mexicanos viewed all these changes under LBJ from 1964 onward. Let's start with African Americans for a moment so we can see the intersection here of race and ethnicity. And we're going to start here with Watts. You see, we talked about the early civil rights movement, but during the 1960s, during the early 60s, the African American civil rights movement was still in its integrationist moment, still focused on breaking down segregation in public institutions, securing voting rights. And this phase of integrationist phase of the civil rights movement climaxed with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Their major legislative goals have been accomplished. But in the wake of these successes, the African American civil rights movement began to fragment, as movements often do in the wake of success. It becomes a game of what's next. So on August 11th, 1965, less than a week after LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act, Los Angeles would erupt into a riot known as the Watts Riot. So what happens is, on August 11th, a drunk driving traffic stop in a predominantly black neighborhood, poor neighborhood known as Watts, escalated into rioting. By the time the Watts riot was over, 34 were dead, 4,000 rioters were in jail, and property damage was over $35 million. And the urban unrest would only continue on through the late 60s as race riots, overwhelmed Chicago, Cleveland, Newark, Detroit, and dozens of other American cities. In Detroit, tanks rolled down the streets with soldiers with machine guns attempting to quell the unrest. And this left liberal white observers saying, wait, why are you doing this? You just got the Civil Rights Act. You just got the Voting Rights Act. What are you still so upset about? And the thing is, though, by the mid-1960s, most of the ethno-racial minorities in the central city ethnic enclaves knew nothing of that supposed post-war prosperity. Was segregation a non-issue outside the South? Outside the migrant farm fields? Of course not. Of course it was a problem. The difference was, in those western and northern cities, life outside the farm, it just wasn't explicitly written into law with Jim and Juan Crow. It was de facto segregation that resulted from socioeconomic residential patterns. In other words, for all the things that were accomplished by the African American civil rights movement in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for all those things, he was very focused on the South, on integrating the schools, integrating the buses, integrating the restaurants, integrating the churches. Those are all great things. But what about the rest of the country? What about blacks and browns in Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver? What about them? That supposed booming economy had kind of passed them by. They're living in these ethnic enclaves that have been turned into ghettos. They're poor. They don't have money. They don't have good education. They can't get out due to racial covenants. In other words, life in these neighborhoods that resulted from white flight had not improved in any tangible way, despite the landmark civil rights legislation. that had been passed in the mid-1960s. And while everyone is patting themselves on the back and cheering that they've accomplished these landmark legislation, and again, don't get me wrong, they're important. Everyone's cheering and patting themselves on the back for doing such a good job, but yet they're still being overpoliced. There's still no money to fund the schools. And when everyone's celebrating the victory, no one's listening. There's still problems. And rioting became one way to, as a response to this racial injustices that white liberals and civil rights leaders seem to be ignoring. As a result, African American groups became more radical and more militant. Such people as Malcolm X, SNCC, once the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they became more violent. The Black Power movement, the Black Panther movement. Each of these groups embraced Blackness. The slogan became Black is Beautiful. Blackness became a source of pride with a new focus, not on integration, not on desegregation, but on equity and equality of opportunity. In other words, yeah, we're citizens. Yep, we have voting rights, but we also need economic equality. We need equal access to jobs and education to get those jobs. And when you look at the Black Panther there, you see them as being very militant. They were scary to white America. Yeah, that's the face that people think about. And they were that, but they were also a group who started food kitchens in the inner cities, started breakfast programs for disadvantaged children so they would have something to eat before they went to school. I mean, they used to serve breakfast at school. When I was a kid, you never had breakfast at school. That was something you did at home. Well, what if your family's too poor to afford it? How then do you sit there all day hungry? You don't learn doing that. You're too hungry with basic necessities and needs to learn something new. So they provided food for kids. They opened clinics in the inner cities because there's no more tax money to fund hospitals and clinics in those now ghettos. But just like the African American movement, which became younger and more quote unquote radical, so did Mexicanos. And this becomes what we term the Chicano movement. The 60s would see a surge in Mexican American civil rights activism, with younger people becoming more engaged in activism than ever before. And they approached the struggle for civil rights with new, more aggressive, and often confrontational methods. Like the embracement of Black is Beautiful by African Americans, no longer trying to be white, Chicanos also embraced a Chicano cultural renaissance that would see an explosion in the arts, celebrating an indigenous past of the ancestry of Mexican Americans, representing a clear break from the idea that they were Caucasian or members of the white race, because clearly they were not being treated as such. The embracement of Chicano was a rejection of European ancestry. They weren't Latin American, they were Chicanos. It was an embracement of their Indian ancestry. And this was done through murals, in paintings, through poetry, through songs of ancient Mesoamerican societies, civilizations like the Aztecs, the Olmecs, the Mayans. In fact, the word Chicano was an indigenous word of the Aztecs. So it became a combination of new activism combined with an indigenous cultural renaissance that came to define the Chicano movement. This was a very different than the more moderate LULAC, who was still trying to embrace Latin American heritage, whiteness. Like the African American movement, which split in the 1960s, the Chicano movement would also embrace more radical group attempts to procure civil rights. For example, La Alianza Federal de los Mercedes, 1963. Formed by activists, this Federal Alliance of Land Grants, formed by activist Ruiz Lopez Tirina in New Mexico, was dedicated to the returning and the restoration of lands that were taken from Chicanos following the Mexican-American War ended in 1848. The object of this was to return the land back to the people. And when they were ignored, they would use violent methods for securing the land. They embraced a method that was known as a people's arrest. For example, at the Kit Carson National Forest Camp Echo Amphitheater in 1966, La Alianza would occupy it on behalf of Native Americans who once owned this land and had it stolen from them. Now, within a week, of course, state police, rangers, and sheriff deputies would move in and it would be unsuccessful. But Alianza would arrest, in fact, 2 of the rangers and try them for treason. In other words, La Alianza was policing the police, conducting these citizens' arrests on behalf of Native Americans and Chicanos. Or similarly, at the Tierra Amarillo raid of 1967, La Alianza would launch an armed raid on the Rio Arriba courthouse to make a citizen's arrest of District Attorney Alfonso Sanchez for his failure to protect the people from land theft. This would end in a shootout with police after launching a raid on the courthouse/jailhouse. Now, La Alianza would change their name in 1967 to La Alianza Federal de Pueblos Libres. And they would hold a convention in New Mexico where it would first be broached the idea of creating a new political party to represent Chicanos, known as La Raza Unida. And Tijerina would eventually be arrested and his wife assaulted, making it clear that he was in the right and the gringo and even Chicanos were in the wrong, would come to galvanize the population, urging them to use more confrontational methods of protest. So Chicanos around the country are seeing this. They're seeing him try to make a difference. And when he's arrested and his wife assaulted, they see the injustice that's being administered here. And it helps to galvanize the Chicano population. And they begin to get, again, more radical. Or take Rudy Gonzalez, aka Corky. Chicano activists, Corky Gonzalez would become the director of Denver's War on Poverty. In 1966, after being fired as the director, he would launch a crusade for justice, and then go on to establish the Crusade for Justice as an anti-discriminatory organization. In 1968, he will lead a boycott of the Coors Brewing Company for discriminatory hiring practices. And then in 1969, he will launch the first National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference, teaching Chicanos about their history and culture, to train them how to organize and fight for their rights. This was a call to arms on the part of Chicanos for liberating themselves from oppression. And very famously, he will give a famous poem known as I Am Joaquin, a poem that would come to galvanize Chicanos. You'll be reading this document and this poem as part of your discussion board readings for the week. In 1965, scholar Rodolfo Acuna, believing that we have history too, referring to Chicanos. He was a Chicano activist and professor of history in Los Angeles. Starts teaching the first Mexican-American history class in Los Angeles. By 1972, he would go on to produce the first ever survey history textbook for Mexican Americans. offering an unapologetic look at the exploitation of Chicanos in the United States, arguing that Mexican Americans lived in a nation as an occupied people, their homeland, citizens, but as an occupied people who suffered massive discrimination, exploitation, and neglect by the larger segment of the U.S. population. This book would come to revolutionize Chicanos, laying a foundation for the emergence of other works on Chicanos like never before. Today, he's known as the father of Chicano history. The result of all of this, Chicanos become more political at all levels of society. In 1967, they form UMAS, the United Mexican American Students, formed by 250 students representing LA colleges and universities from 7 different colleges and universities in Los Angeles, demanding that they would offer more classes on Mexican American history, that more Chicanos be hired as faculty, and that more Chicanos be recruited as students. The following year, 1968, they would join with the Black Student Union at UCLA to unite, demanding more classes on Mexican American, African American studies. And this more radicalization does lead to more unity among the students of color. It would also lead to Rosalio Muñez, who was elected as the first Chicano student body president in 1968. You remember those Viva Kennedy clubs that helped get JFK elected? Well, do you remember those Equal Opportunity Employment Commission from the Great Society that helped enforce non-discriminatory hiring practices? Yeah, those things come together here. 1966, at an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission meeting in New Mexico, several Chicanos, including Rudy Gonzalez, would storm out in the form of protest from a meeting with LBJ and several other members of JFK's administration due to a lack of Mexican American appointments to jobs that were promised them for helping to get Kennedy elected in 1960 as part of the Viva Kennedy clubs. Now, LBJ seized the opportunity to acknowledge that Mexican Americans deserved more attention from his administration. He said, quote, "I think they've been discriminated against in housing, in education, in jobs. I don't think we can be very proud of our record in that field. If they are ready for a conference, I will be ready," unquote. Nevertheless, he really refused to commit to any specifics. But in response, Rudy Ramos and other Washington members of the GI Forum would march in front of the White House on Easter Sunday. They were joined by the EEOC Commissioner Richard Graham and his family. The demonstration was christened a huelga, a strike. The walkout at the EEOC meeting showed the growing sense of militancy on the part of the Mexican American community that was only going to grow by the late 60s. For example, in 1967, youth in Texas would come together into a hyper-militant Chicano organization known as the Mexican American Youth Organization, MAYO, made up of young people who would use more aggressive methods for securing civil rights. They would organize several protests and walkouts in schools. We would also see the creation in 1967 of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, established in San Antonio by Willie Velazquez, who would become the legal arm for securing civil rights for Latinos. They would launch several court cases against schools and institutions, protesting against discrimination, separation, segregation. And with these two together would lead a massive student movement that became known as the Chicana and Chicano Walkout movement. All this is leading to right here, the blowouts. Like the African Americans with the sit-in movement, something that Chicanos would also embrace, Chicano youth also began to embrace the walkout as an effective tool to demonstrate and protest for equality. This movement was an influential event in the rise of the youth movement and responsible for adding to the larger Chicano movement. It was just one of numerous forms of protest used by the community to challenge the ill conditions of the schools, to also preserve existing cultural traditions, and to ensure community survival. And these youth would engage the walkout movement that became popularly known as blowouts. The goal, of course, was to bring attention to the educational plights of Chicanos, to make schools more responsive to the needs of the Chicano communities, to improve and preserve the quality of education, and to gain political power. The problem, though, was schools were, and many times still are, oppressive institutions that funneled Chicanas and Chicanos into service industry jobs, to the military, or even to prison. Schools were still largely segregated by the late 60s, now based on economic and racial covenants as a result of white flight. They lacked Chicano teachers, lacked Chicano administrators, lacked Chicano counselors. They lacked classes related to Mexican American history and culture. The classrooms they went to school in were overcrowded. The teachers were culturally insensitive, badly trained. The result of all this was Chicanos suffered from extremely high dropout rates. And so the strategy of these blowouts was to financially hurt the schools in the school districts. Because remember, as we should know, schools receive federal funding based off the annual daily attendance, which is why these walkouts, these blowouts, took place most often prior to roll call for the day. A financial burden, they figured, would force schools to negotiate immediately. So students began to make demands, and every walkout would produce a slight variation of the same list of student demands, including things like requests for the development and implementation of bilingual and bicultural education. Makes sense. The creation of programs aimed at addressing the problems faced by migrant students, first generation, new arrivals. The hiring of Chicano teachers and admin, smaller classes. The firing of racist faculty, principals, and counselors, especially those who were targeting Chicano students from applying and dissuading them from applying for college, suggesting they'd be better off to go to the armed services, the military, or go to vocational training schools rather than university. Now, the response, however, was usually swift and negative. School officials would prevent students from leaving. They issued threats. They locked doors or campus gates. Can we say fire hazard? They simply ignored the demands. They resorted to disciplinary action like suspension, expulsions, or even withholding of diplomas. Local law enforcement and other agencies would use violent methods to suppress the boycotts, the walkouts. They would call police in to investigate, infiltrate, conduct surveillance, and disrupt the walkouts. They would make arrests and other forms of police harassment to any student protester. City officials pretty much mirrored the response of schools. They try to censor the strikes, keep the press away from it. The media tended to paint these strikes or these walkouts in a very negative light. And then there's the Mexican American parents. Many of them would come to the aid of their children, but many also disagreed with the methods. And many actually supported the incarceration of the organizers of these walkouts. Because even the term Chicano, or the attitude of Chicano, was sometimes viewed very negatively by the older generation. as their methods were deemed too radical and possibly criminal. Some parents associated the idea of Chicano with gang activity. In fact, in many interviews I conducted, Mexicanos recalled their parents associating Chicanos with gangs, violence, something to keep their kids away from. So while they themselves were trying to make good, produce change, many parents actively worked against them. Let me give you some examples of some of these walkouts, actual events. The East LA walkouts are one of the most famous ones. In 1968, a walkout was planned and coordinated at the East LA high schools, where approximately 10,000 students peacefully walked out of 4 schools, joined by parents and supporters. They walked out in protest of discriminatory practices and the assimilationist character of the school system. Be white or else. The police were sent to maintain order and things quickly got out of hand. Following the police riot, students would walk out again. The walkouts would continue for 2 weeks until their demands were met. Now, one of the leaders of this movement was Sal Castro, a 34-year-old high school teacher from East Los Angeles. He began looking for ways to organize his students who were victims of various discriminatory practices and policies of the schools. And he became a major influence to the students and a major organizer of the walkouts. And he would be fired for his participation in the walkout. Known as the LA 13, these students were arrested and indicted by a grand jury for conspiracy to disrupt the peace in schools by organizing the walkout. So 13 students would be arrested, known as the LA 13. They'd be arrested and indicted for conspiracy to disrupt the peace in school because they were the ones who supposedly organized the walkouts. In response to this, in response to the LA 13, in response to Sal Castro being fired, students' parents would form a new organization, the Brown Berets, to protest Castro's removal and demand his reinstatement. The Brown Berets has officially been established in 1967 by David Sanchez as a self-defense group against police violence. But they would be very instrumental in protesting the student walkout issue, the LA 13, Sal Castro's firing in Los Angeles. The Brown Berets were the more militant group of the Chicano movement. They were adults. They would dress in army-style clothing, very similar to the Black Panther Party. They would use confrontational tactics and were in direct opposition to the more mainstream integrationist strategy of LULAC. The older Chicanos formed this Brown Beret, looking very similar, of course, to the Black Panthers. They began working toward uniting the neighborhood gangs, calling an end to internal neighborhood violence. They would grab onto the growing community health movement. They would open free clinics. They would provide breakfast programs as chapters spread throughout the country from Los Angeles to San Antonio, Chicago to Detroit. And then what's funny? I have the book on my bookshelf. There's a great book about the Brown Berets. And the one thing the historian noted was that they're trying to bring those warring gang factions of San Antonio together. This is kind of founded in San Antonio, and it kind of moved elsewhere to Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago. And what he noted was that when the Brown Berets formed, first of all, Anglo-America, they were scared. These were militant, looking brown-skinned people, much like the Black Panther Party scared them. But they also found that violent crime in the neighborhoods where the Brown Berets were active drastically went down because they were able to funnel the angst that led to gang activity and crime into something healthier. like breakfast programs and free health clinics. And in response to the Los Angeles School District, issue with Sal Castro and the LA 13 issue, they would hold a series of protests in front of the sheriff offices and police stations in Los Angeles. They would serve as protectors of people in communities and at demonstrations and rallies. Once again, they were going to police the police. Armed. Could be dangerous. Very similar to the Black Panthers. And as a result of this, the school board would eventually return Sal Castro to the classroom. Now, I do have an interview or a video of this I want to show you guys. It's a little bit lengthy. I don't like to show long videos during a recorded lecture like this. But as I would show this to you in class if we were face to face, I do want you to get an understanding here and just hear Sal Castro in his own words.
Now, of course, I was also involved in 68, and I remember my walking out. And when I was a senior, I ended up leading 3 walkouts. And by then, Paula Cristostomo, who was featured in the walkout film, was one of the leaders. She actually worked at Marquette High School when I was there. So I also developed that work and got the leadership training. But I do agree with Montezuma. It took a lot longer. And to see the mobilization now is really amazing to me, but it's also important that young people are already conscious and coherent about what the issues are. I think all it took was people to say, let's mobilize, let's get organized, let's get these things moving. And the leadership, I think, is getting to the point where it's engendering new leadership. Young people themselves are gaining the leadership that took a few years in the past. Now it's happening much more quickly.
Did you see this movie, Walkout?
Actually, I went to the conference this weekend, and I saw it at the CYLC. They showed us a documentary, and I did see it.
And what did you think?
It was beautiful. Beautiful in the fact of how much power it's. A lot of students, at least at my school and that I've spoken to, they've seen it. And that, to me, I'm hoping motivates them to see that if you were put on lockdown, that shows how much power the students have. If they had to put you on lockdown, you still were willing and they couldn't stop you to walk out. To me, that was very powerful.
Moctezuma Esparza, I wanted...
And I'm going to stop it right there. And there's a movie called Walkout. It's on HBO Max if you have a subscription to it. And I'm going to try to get a copy for you all to watch as well. It's a powerful movie that depicts what happened in Los Angeles. Now, this idea of the walkout movement is going to spread. And it's going to spread, again, initially we talked about it in Los Angeles. It's going to spread in places like Texas as well, especially around San Antonio. And for instance, in San Antonio, more than 700 students are going to walk out of Lanier High School, 600 more at Edgewood High School, in Crystal City ISD. It would spread through 39 towns across Texas to more than 100 high schools in 10 different states ultimately. And again, they're protesting the usual list of suspects. Curriculum that was pushing Mexican Americans toward manual labor, away from college. Deteriorating school conditions, students lacking essential items, censoring over the use of Spanish language, lack of bilingual and bicultural education, lack of Chicano teachers. And then it got bigger. In places like Kingville, they were calling for the removal of teachers that they were claiming were trying to force them to assimilate to white American culture and brainwash them, telling them that their Spanish heritage and Mexican heritage is bad. The most famous of these, though, occurred in Crystal City, Texas. In Crystal City, students complained about not being allowed to speak Spanish. They were also prevented from participation in extracurricular activities and clubs. There was no classes about Mexican American history, culture, literature, the forced into vocational training. Chicano students were being placed into classes to prepare them for industrial work as opposed to preparing them for college. But they also protested something new that was a little bit different. They protested that young Chicanas, these young girls, were not being allowed to participate on the cheer squad or on homecoming court. because the homecoming court was voted on by past members who were all Anglo, and they would not choose a brown girl. And led in part by the Mexican American Youth Organization, Mayo, they began to push for these walkouts. And they would help push these walkouts throughout the state of Texas. Now, success-wise, it's pretty low. There aren't a lot of success here. Change was slow. And media portrayal stigmatized Mexicanos even more as a result. Yes, in Crystal City, girls were allowed to join the cheer squad, finally. And they were allowed to be on homecoming court. And yes, boys would be allowed to join the basketball team. But the larger systemic problems were more difficult to change. For example, Houston ISD, the ISD that pushed back on any reforms after students protest HISD's cuts by the school board to the free lunch program that affected more than 4,000 Mexican American students. They protested HISD's refusal to recognize Mexican Americans as a distinct ethno-racial group for integration purposes. Remember, HISD, Houston ISD, was using loopholes to justify the rejection of this. Remember, they're supposed to integrate the schools, right? But instead of integrating Mexican Americans and African Americans into those Anglo suburban schools, following Brown v. Board of Education, they instead said, well, we'll just integrate Mexican Americans as white and put them and integrate them with the blacks students and leave the white schools untouched. And in Houston, the courts clearly defined Chicanos as part of the Caucasian majority, legitimizing, therefore, their pairing with the African American student schools to achieve integration. This loophole became a central issue, as these schools were very underfunded, ill-equipped, understaffed, large class sizes. And these walkouts would be soundly rejected by Houston ISD. But while the short-term success was limited, there will be some long-term gains. The walkouts were responsible for producing major educational improvements, specifically regarding school policy and student treatment. It would lead to the development of courses on Mexican history and culture, responsible for the hiring of more Chicano teachers. And it forced school officials to develop programs designed to address the special needs of Chicano students, whether it's language acquisition skills or classes that would help funnel these students into college track education versus vocational track or military. And as a result, in 1970, the walkouts would play a critical role in the buildup to a landmark court case, Cisneros versus Corpus Christi, ISD, 1970, in which a federal judge officially recognized Mexican Americans as an identifiable ethnic minority group when it came for purposes of desegregation. So finally, a federal court ruled that Mexicanos, Chicanos, were an identifiable ethnic group separate from whites, and that you could no longer use them as a loophole to integrate schools, but yet keep Anglo white schools separate. And please, guys, note this. This was not strictly a male Chicano endeavor. This was heavily participated by both males and females, Chicanos and Chicanas. Though until recently, the story of Chicanos has largely been absent. And while this was at the local political level, at school levels and city levels, it would also create a larger, broader political movement. One of the primary activists at Crystal City, Texas, was Jose Angel Gutierrez, who would go on to form La Raza Unida, a political party for Chicanos, translated the United Race. He helps establish this because of the disservice provided by the established political organizations. Crystal City, Texas becomes the first U.S. city to have a Chicano third party in controlling local government. La Raza Unida would see unprecedented victories across the state. Gutierrez himself would be an elected county judge. La Raza Unida party members would go on to control the school board, as well as city and county governments across Texas. And by 1972 would lead the first Chicano potential candidate for president of the United States in Ben Fernandez, a former migrant laborer himself. In all these things, we say the radical 60s, they were more confrontational. They were more in your face and more about demanding equality and access. Was that really radical, or just what should have been done a long time ago? Now we're going to stop here, but when we come back next time, we'll see what happens next. So until then, take care and bye-bye.